Amen. We have the parable charts. If anyone needs a chart of the parables, raise your hand and we can get you that chart. We are looking at the parable of the unjust steward. And we read through it rather quickly last week. We're going to go over it again. This is only found in Luke's account, and I think it is by far the most difficult parable that Jesus gave in trying to understand what he is saying. Now, I don't think it's impossible to understand. I think it's difficulty, and it's going to take a little bit of thinking for us to get the point that Jesus is saying here. In Luke 16 and verse 1, he also said to his disciples, "There was a certain rich man who had a steward, and an accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods." So there's a rich man, he has a steward. Now what's the definition of a steward? Well, kind of. That's part of it. Right. He's in charge of someone else's that doesn't belong to him. Things that don't belong to him. He's a steward, caretaker, so to speak, of someone else's goods. And he serves in that capacity. That he was wasting his goods. So he wasn't being a good steward. Verse 2, "So he called him and said to him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward.'" So there the master is calling him into account, and he's going to give an account of his stewardship. Then the steward said within himself, "What shall I do? For my master is taking the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I have resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses." So he called every one of his master's debtors to him, and said to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, "Take your bill, sit down, and quickly write 50. Then he said to another, "And how much do you owe?" So he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, "Take your bill and write 80. So he's reducing the debt that is owed to the master. And he's doing this for a reason. Verse 4, that he may be received into their houses. He's doing them a favor, preparing for his future when he is put out of the stewardship, because he says, "I'm not going to dig, I'm not going to do hard labor, and I'm not going to beg. So I'm going to need a place to stay once I'm fired," so to speak. Verse 8, "So the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. And I say to you, make friends for yourself by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much. He who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in what is another man's, who will give you what is your own? No servant can serve two masters. He will either hate the one and love the other. He also be loyal to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." Okay. Here you have the unjust servant being commended by the master in verse 8 because he dealt shrewdly. Now, what's it mean to deal shrewdly? What's a definition of that? No, not deceptive in this case. Calculating, that's a good definition of that word. He dealt wisely. He thought ahead. He calculated. He prepared. And I think that's the point that Jesus is trying to get across. Remember, at the beginning of talking about the parables, we said usually parable has one main point. And I believe the point that Jesus is trying to get across here is you need to prepare for your future. He is not commending the man for being unjust. What this man did was underhanded. It was dishonest. What he did with the master's debtors wasn't right. However, what was he doing? He was looking ahead and saying, I got to prepare or I'm going to be out on the street. So he thought about, here's what I'm going to do. I got to get ready for this. So I'll have people who said, you did me a favor, come stay with us. So the stewardship there is the concept of taking care of something that does not belong to you, and the concept of preparing for the future. And so this man was acting shrewdly. That's why the master said, that was a smart move on your part to do what you were doing. Because the one that owed oil, he cut that bill in half. Then the one that owed wheat, he cut that bill by, 20%? He was saying, you owe less now. That was not by the master's approval. Master didn't approve of that. But he's saying, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine, so to speak. When I get fired, I'm going to have a place to stay. I'm going to have a place to stay. I'm preparing for my future. I got to get ready for this. I got to get ready for what's about to happen. I'm about to get fired because I was not being a good steward. That actually impressed the master because he dealt shrewdly. Then Jesus says in verse 8, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. Here's one of these rare occasions where he's saying sometimes worldly people can be wiser than the children of light. Who would be the children of light? Christians. In the fact that worldly people prepare for their future, and sometimes the sons of light don't. They don't think about the future. But what do people of the world do? They prepare for their future. They store up vast wealths of money for retirement. They're thinking about themselves and what's going to happen, when they retire, or if the business goes under, or if things don't go very well, they get fired. They have something prepared for them. He said there's really wisdom in that, preparing for the future. And that's the point he's getting across. And that's why he says in verse 9, and I say to you, make friends for yourself by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. The unrighteous mammon. What is mammon there? Money, riches, is a word. I think it's an Aramaic word that means riches and money. And he says you're going to have to prepare yourself for the future so that when you fail, I think that failure there is talking about death. You may be received into everlasting home. In other words, you're living in this world, you're going to have to use your unrighteous mammon, that is, the riches that are around about you, in a wise manner, because you're going to fail and you're going to have a place to stay when you die. You're going to have a place to stay. And that means you're preparing for the future. You're preparing for the afterlife. Of course, we want to go to a better place, not a bad place when we die. So you need to be prepared for that. You see, eternal punishment is the place for the unprepared. Heaven is a prepared place for a prepared people. You don't accidentally go to heaven. A lot of multitudes will accidentally, so to speak, go to hell. They'll be lost. Carelessness, selfishness, they're not preparing. But to go to heaven, you got to purpose that. You got to prepare. You got to lay up treasures in heaven, Jesus said. That's your eternal retirement in heaven. Because when you fail, and that failure being death, I believe, Hebrews 9:27, it's appointed unto man once to die, after that the judgment, then you'll have everlasting home to go into. And so he's giving a lesson here about being prepared, being wise, being shrewd in preparing for your future. The master commended the unjust steward because he dealt shrewdly. He said, that's a smart move, what you did, in preparing that you'll have a place to stay once you're fired. And so that's the point. He's using this to illustrate we've got to prepare ourselves. And when he talks about unrighteous mammon, that's a use of our riches as well. We live in a society and we work for businesses, whether a corporation or whatever, that's full of wicked people. Now, if you work for the church, you're supposed to be working for righteous folk. But if you're working for a business, you're working, and let's say Walmart, for example. Wicked people, ungodly, immoral, unrighteous mammon. We need to use that to get ready for heaven. The money that we get in working with people who are involved in unrighteous mammon, the unrighteous riches, we need to use that and be good stewards of that in a righteous way to get ready for the everlasting home. Any questions or comments about that before we go any further? I believe that's the explanation of verse 9. As one commentator says, a man has an obligation to use his material possessions to support God's work, to take care of his family, to pay taxes, and to help others. We got to pay tax. Use this unrighteous mammon. We live in a wicked society. We got to pay taxes. We got to do these things. However, we're not to be overcome by riches. That's the point of verse 13. No servant can serve two masters. We can't be enslaved to riches. You can't serve God and mammon. You can't serve riches and God. So that goes back to the concept of God wanting our undivided allegiance. Why? Because God is a jealous God. He deserves our focus. He deserves our life. He deserves us putting Him first because of who He is. Back up to verse 10. He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much, and he who is unjust in what is least, unjust also in much. What does verse 10 mean? What's that referring to? I believe that's the point he's trying to make. If you can't be faithful with least things, you're not going to be trusted to do more things. And that's why in a business, you think about the business concept, a boss looking at employees that they are entrusted with a little at first, then they go up higher, get more responsibility. It's because they were faithful in a little. They were faithful in a little. So they're given more responsibility, promotion. They're faithful in that, and perhaps more promotion. So that concept there, if you can't be faithful in least small things, you're not going to be faithful in big things. So it's emphasizing dependability. It's emphasizing the fact that we have to be faithful in what we have, no matter what it is. We need to be faithful with $10 or $10 million. If we make $10 a week, we need to use that wisely. We need to use that to the glory of God. We need to use a portion of that to give upon the first day of the week, or whether we make $10 million a week. And when some people say, and I've had people actually tell me this, I'll give more when I get this raise. They give scraps, $2 or $3, they could give more. But when I get this big promotion and this big raise, I'm going to give a lot more. Most likely not. Because if you can't give sacrificially with the least, you're not going to give sacrificially when you get that big promotion. See, God is not concerned with what you're going to do if you had thus or so. He's concerned with what you're doing now with what you got. And if you're faithful in that, you will be given more, especially ultimately in heaven. Verse 11, therefore, if you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? What does verse 11 mean? What would be the true riches? Heaven. I think it parallels verse 9, the everlasting home. So the material things, unrighteous things, verse 11, if you can't be a faithful, good steward with unrighteous material things here upon the earth, who will commit to your trust true riches? In other words, if you can't deal with the material things here upon the earth properly, then you're not going to be entrusted with everlasting homes or the true riches of heaven. Because in heaven, there's going to be responsibility. I don't understand all of that, but the book of Revelation tells us we're going to serve God. I don't know what that means. But I know it's going to be forever, and it's going to be in a perfect capacity. It's going to be without sin. But there's going to be responsibility in heaven of some sort. And if you can't take care of things here upon the earth, if you can't get it together here upon the earth, how are you going to be trusted with true riches? I believe that's the point he's trying to make here. Jesus had a lot to say about material things and our attitude towards riches. A lot to say. And we've emphasized this before. It's not the concept of being rich, it's what we do with those riches. That's why Paul tells Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6, you command those who are rich, don't trust in that. You be rich in good works, and you help. You use your money to help other people. And thank God for those who do, who will use their riches to help those who are in need. I mean, this church has benefited from that over the years. You know, years ago, this church used to help a lot of people in spreading the gospel and such, and now we've gotten to the point where we need help, and thank God for good brethren who are willing to help us out in our time of need. So it's dealing with the concept of a steward preparing for his future. And the fact that we can't serve God with a divided allegiance. In verse 13. You cannot serve two masters. And if you try to, you'll be miserable. You'll be miserable trying to. Worldly members of the church aren't really that happy because they're not doing what they ought to do, and they know that. They really do know it. Some of them do. So they can't enjoy all the joys of Christianity. And they can't enjoy all the pleasures of sin because they can't go headlong into it, because they got one foot in the church and one foot in the world, so they're lukewarm. They're neither hot nor cold. They're trying to do what Jesus said is impossible to do, serve two masters. We need to be good stewards of the riches that God blesses us with, and to use this all to the glory of God. You know, in verse 14 it says, "Now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, also heard all these things, and they derided him." What's other translations say? Derided? Besides derided in verse 14. Ridiculed. Mocked him. Pharisees who were lovers of money. Sounds like so many people today. Lovers of money. They heard all that he's saying about materialism, the dangers of materialism, how that we need to prepare for spiritual things, the concept of laying up treasure in heaven. We need to prepare for that. And they heard, and they mocked him. They derided him. They made fun of him. Because they were lovers of money. Again, what did Paul say in 1 Timothy chapter 6? In verse 6. "Now godliness with contentment is great gain." One young man read that verse incorrectly. He said, "Now godliness with contentment is great pain." And that's how so many people view that. It's a pain to try to be content. Verse 7. "For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. No U-Haul behind a hearse." Verse 8. "Having food and clothing, with these we shall be content." Verse 9. "But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many sorrows." If you love money, the fruit of that will be many sorrows. How many families have been torn apart due to an inheritance? And it's because the family members love the money. They think they're owed something. And families have been torn apart as a result of that. And it's created so many sorrows. So, you see also the problem with gambling. It's interesting that with gambling, you go to casinos, they'll have a 1-800 number that you can call if you get addicted to gambling. Right there in the casino, they have the 1-800 number. And so they know the danger of it. And how many people have taken their children's savings for college and spent it on the horse races or spent it on the casinos, and their children and their families have just been hurt. Again, sorrows. That's the love of money. And there's so many examples of how materialism brings about so many sorrows. But the point that Jesus is making in Luke chapter 16 is we need to use it wisely. We need to prepare for the future. Use the money that we have to prepare for the future. That's why I think it is great when people put in their will the church. And say, when I pass away, I want this money to go to the church. Because family might take it and spend it on who knows what. But if it's a good, faithful congregation, they're going to take that money and they're going to use it to the glory of God. And that faithful brother or sister who's about to go into the next life, about to go into the true riches, saying, I'm going to leave this behind for the brethren to use to glorify God. And I think that's a great thing when that happens. Many congregations have benefited from that attitude. Any questions or comments about that before we go on to the next one? The next one is called a parable, but for so many reasons I don't think it's a parable. I don't have a big problem with it being called a parable, the rich man and Lazarus. But for the fact that Lazarus is named goes against 99% of the parables that you find in the gospel accounts. And it's not talking about something fictitious. Parables were never fictitious. They were actual things that happened. And when people try to say this is a parable, therefore it didn't really happen, a lot of times it's religious groups who don't believe in an afterlife, like Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, the World Tomorrow program that's on TV. It's been on for years. They don't believe in an afterlife in the sense of when you die that your spirit goes somewhere. They believe in a resurrection at the end of time, then you come back into existence. There's no waiting place between death and the resurrection. You just cease to exist. And so they dismiss this as a parable. Well, it wouldn't be right to call that a parable, because if Jesus is saying something that isn't true, it's a fable. Fables are fictitious, where you have talking animals and talking trees and things like that. Jesus never taught in fables. He taught in parables. And there's nothing in these passages that contradict the totality of the Bible concerning the afterlife. There's an interesting phrase found throughout the book of Genesis. When it talks about the patriarch, when a person dies, it said he was gathered to his people. And it's not talking about his body. Sometimes the body is buried away from the family burial. He died and he was gathered to his people. Do a study on that phrase. And it's referring to the afterlife. I believe it was Rachel when she was dying, that she named Benjamin. And it says, as her spirit departed. Again, Genesis is telling us there's an afterlife. And you go through all of the Old Testament, you find the concept of Sheol in the Old Testament. Sometimes, a lot of times, translated the grave. But it's referring to an afterlife. In the New Testament, the word that's equivalent to Sheol is Hades. There's a good video that I'm going to get labeled and bring it tonight. It's on Where Do We Go When We Die? Don Blackwell put together a really good lesson on that, and I'll make them available tonight for us to have a copy. And it's just a really good study in the afterlife. And so what Jesus is talking about here with the rich man Lazarus is nothing fictitious when you take the totality of the Bible. Now, when the Bible talks about a person sleeping in death, Jesus went to go wake up Lazarus in John chapter 11. What was sleeping in death? The body. The Bible never talks about the spirit being asleep or the soul being asleep. But when it's talking about death, and it says they're asleep, it's talking about the body. It's always talking about the body. Never refers to the spirit or the soul. That's a metaphor depicting death. And so Jesus here is going to talk about people going into the next life. Just to kind of skip ahead to kind of give us a historical context, this would be before the cross because of verse 31. Abraham says they have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. They won't listen to Moses and the prophets. That would be the Old Testament. Neither will they be persuaded though one rise from the dead. So that kind of gives us a historical perspective. This is before the cross. Because that's referring to the Old Testament. If they won't listen to the Word of God, Moses and the prophets, that's a way to describe the Old Testament scriptures, then they will not be persuaded though one rise from the dead. How's Sarah doing? She had a room? Or did they keep her? Or run test? Okay. Right, right. Right. Appreciate all that you do for her. Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31, Jesus is giving us a glimpse into the afterlife. Now, we don't have a whole lot in the Bible as far as details about the afterlife. And we have glimpses of what it's going to be like. For the innocent and the righteous, it's going to be wonderful. For the wicked, the lost, it's going to be terrible. That's basically what we find out about the afterlife. So this is before the cross. This is before the judgment day. This is before the resurrection from the dead. Where do we go when we die? Look at verse 19. There was a certain rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. Here's a person who had it made, living what people would say today is the American dream. Verse 20. But there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, full of sores, who was laid at his gate. So here's a person that is rock bottom, full of sores, laid at his gate. He's in a terrible condition. He's named, again, that's uncharacteristic of parables. Verse 21, desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. And so here you see he's in a deplorable condition. He had sores, and the dogs came and licked the sores. These would not be your friendly puppy dogs. These would be the street dogs. And it's just really emphasizing the pitiful condition this man is in physically. Physically. And how things appear and seem on earth may not be a spiritual reality. So it was that the beggar died and was carried by angels to Abraham's bosom. And the rich man also died and was buried. Hebrews 9:27. There the appointment comes. It's going to come to all of us. The spirit departed the body, the beggar died, and angels. So there's an angelic escort, at least two, because it says angels, come and escort his soul into what is called Abraham's bosom. That is a Hebrew expression that denotes paradise. Remember what Jesus said to the thief when he was on the cross? Today you will be with me in paradise. This is the same place. Abraham's bosom is paradise. It's an expression of comfort, an expression of a great place to be. I think this verse can be used to tell us that. I think this verse is telling this is what happens when a righteous person dies, what's going to happen. That the soul is going to be transported to paradise or Abraham's bosom. I don't know of any other verse. There might be. I do know, I think it's Psalm 90. We live 70 years, perhaps 80 years. Soon we're cut off and we fly away. Verse 10, that's right. Psalm 90 verse 10. So we live 70 or 80 years and then we fly away. So that's, again, the soul departing from the body. Hebrews 1:14, yeah, that's talking about the angels that serve us. And I think that would be part of that service, taking us to that realm of paradise when our soul departs the body. Are they not ministering spirits sent forth to minister for those who will inherit salvation? Most definitely. I think that would be part of their service that they render to us. So here you have this man dying in deplorable conditions, but died in a better state than the rich man. The rich man also died and was buried. Notice there was nothing said about burying the beggar. You know what they would do? Sometimes they would take, if they find someone on the street, they'd take them to the trash dump. There wouldn't be a burial for the street people. The rich man died and was buried. There probably was an elaborate funeral for him. Just talking about how wonderful he was. And being in torments in Hades, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. Now the tables have turned. Being in torments in Hades. Now this word Hades, it comes from, there was a Greek god named Hades. He was the god of the underworld. He dealt with the dead people in Greek mythology. But the word Hades means the unseen realm. The unseen realm. It's the place the departed spirits go. Everyone dies and goes to Hades. Because it says in Acts chapter 2, Jesus' soul went to Hades. And when he was resurrected, his soul was not left in Hades. It reunited with his body in the resurrection. So Hades here, the unfortunate thing in the King James Version, it's translated hell. In 1600s, there was not a separate word for hell that can be translated from the Greek word Hades. And so they translated Hades, hell, and they translated Gehenna, hell. And it caused a lot of confusion. There was not a separate word. Modern day translations have taken Hades in the Greek and made it Hades. It's a transliteration of that word. And it is a waiting place for the dead before the resurrection at the end of time. It's where Jesus went when he died, and on the third day he came out of. Now there's two realms in that dimension. We don't use that phrase dimension. There is torment, and then there is paradise, Abraham's bosom. They all went to Hades when they died. Everyone who dies goes to Hades. But you either go to paradise or you go to torment. Well, the rich man, being in torment, lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. So we see, we don't go out of existence when we die. There is consciousness. He lifted up his eyes, whatever that meant for a spirit. That somehow he was able to see. It's using accommodative language because that's how we see with the eyes. So he was able to see. He saw afar off Abraham afar off. Abraham was still in existence. And Lazarus in his bosom. And also we learn from this, we retain our identity. Abraham was still Abraham. Lazarus was still Lazarus. The rich man was still the rich man. And there was recognition. He knew that was Lazarus. He knew that was Abraham. Verse 24. He cried and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. I mean, that is just a haunting verse to read. Verse 25, and Abraham said, Son, remember that in your life you received the good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things, but now he is comforted, and you are tormented. The righteous go to a place of comfort. Revelation 14 and verse 13, Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord, that they may rest. 14:13, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them. Comfort. What's it say in Revelation chapter 6 about those who had been killed for the cause of Christ, been beheaded? They were given white garments and they were told to rest. Rest for a little while. So when you're right with God and you die in that condition, you go to a place of comfort. If you're wrong, you go to a place of torment. Verse 16, and besides all this, between us and you, there is a great gulf fixed, so that those who want to pass from here to you cannot, nor can those from there pass to us. That gulf, a separation, a chasm that cannot be crossed. Once you die, you can't change your state. There's no purgatory. Now, I know I watch TV shows like Sleepy Hollow, and they talk about purgatory and stuff like that. That's fantasy. That's not what the Bible teaches. It's a part of a Catholic false doctrine. There is no purgatory where you can go there for a while, suffer for your sins, and then you're good enough to go to heaven. It's not in the Bible. You die wrong with God, there's no changing that. There's a gulf that's fixed. Here, you can change. That's the beauty of it. Ezekiel 18, you can make a choice. You can choose to be good according to God's will, or you can choose not to. But once you die, there's no fixing it. There's no fixing. There is this gulf that is fixed, this chasm that is fixed. There's no passing between. Lazarus cannot give you comfort. Notice, he just wanted a drop of water on his tongue. He's so tormented, he just wanted a little drop, just a little relief. There's none. Well, Abraham told him, remember. So the rich man in torment could remember his life. That may be part of the torment too. All the opportunities he had, all the times he chose not to do what's right. That might be a part of that torment that he had as well. But as far as having anything to do, I think it's in the book of Ecclesiastes, it says that the dead have nothing to do with those who are under the sun. That's talking about us in this realm. The dead have nothing to do with it. Now, I can't think of that verse right offhand, but it's in the book of Ecclesiastes. They have nothing more to do with what's going on under the sun, because they're in a totally different realm. But at least we see here that the rich man could remember. That's what he said. Remember, son, what you had in your life. Right. Remember the brothers. That's what he's going to talk about here. Very quickly. I think that's it, yeah. I think it was 9:5. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in the context there, it's dealing with those under the sun, which means this earthly life. So, verse 27, then he said, I beg you therefore, Father, that you would send him to my father's house. For I have 5 brothers, that he may testify to them, lest they also come to this place of torment. He's concerned about his brothers dying in a wrong condition. And Abraham said to him, they have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. They have the word of God. They have their opportunity. Let them hear them. He said, no, Father Abraham, but if one goes to them from the dead, they will repent. He said to him, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded though one rise from the dead. Someone said, well, maybe if someone came back and told me. No, You're not going to listen to the testimony of God's Word, as powerful as it is. You're not going to listen. And Jesus did come back from the dead, and still multitudes didn't believe in Him. So your fate is sealed. That's the point. The fate is sealed once you die, and that's why we've got to be right with God when we die, when we face that appointment. And it's going to be a wonderful thing. I think, and of course this is before heaven after the judgment and before hell after the judgment. But I think heaven is going to be more wonderful than can be described, and that hell will be more terrible than can be described. I think it's given to us in accommodative language for our minds to comprehend. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, just with that thought, we'll dive into this more next week because time is up. No, excuse me. I think it's 2 Corinthians 5. 2 Corinthians 5. Paul talks about dying and being naked, unclothed. See, God created us to be compound beings. I used to think, what's the point of the resurrection if we die and we go to paradise? What's the point? Well, God created us to be body and soul. And in 2 Corinthians 5, it says, when we die, we depart, we're naked. And in other words, we're in a sense, we're incomplete. But then, in the resurrection, we'll be clothed with immortality in a much better body, glorified body. So yes, the righteous dead are comforted, but they're not complete. That's the point of the resurrection. Any more than that, I will refer you to Deuteronomy 29:29. We just got to stick with what is revealed. Okay, next week, Lord willing, we'll continue our thoughts with this, talk about the afterlife some more, and probably go into the parable of the unprofitable servants, chapter 17.